what have you achieved?
Oh, come on, friends, you've got to do better than that. Look, I'm the first person ever to write a PhD on the history of women's football.
Yeah.
So that's my only claim to fame.
And what subjects do you teach?
I teach the history of sport in Australia. I teach into history of sport in the Western world. There's a football studies subject we teach. I used to teach sport, gaming and gambling, and I also help out in Olympic studies, etc.
Awesome, good to go. Yeah, we can.
Right. I'm here with Rob Hess, author of.
You don't need to rate.
don't
Just
need-
literally ask, because when I'm going to use the questions, so you can just say them and then.
Yeah.
No need to.
Yeah, no, I'll see. Yeah, it's just gonna.
So do I need to
Yeah, so if you
restate the
could-
question?
Yeah, if you could try and do it so you're asking and
Yeah,
answering
okay.
the same thing.
Yeah. First and foremost, I'd just like to thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. It's great.
Sure.
Yeah. And first question: how different were the early games of women's football to the AFLW League of 2017, and why?
The AFLW League has been a phenomenal success. The league kicked off in 2017, and the AFL promotion for that has made a slight mention of the fact that this has been 100 years in the making, which is true, because the first games were played back in 1915. And interestingly, it's a phenomenon that went from west to east, because the game started in Perth, went to South Australia, and then to New South Wales, and then eventually to Victoria. So it goes against the flow in a way, because normally we think that everything good about football comes out of Victoria, but in this case, something good about football, i.e. the inception of women's football, actually came out of Perth. The games were different in the sense that women were playing genuinely competitive games for the first time, but they were wearing what was seen to be the normal attire of the day. That is, long skirts, silk dresses, tunics, and little jockey-style caps. And these were dresses that they made themselves. So that restricted them quite a bit. And when I show images of these games to my, still images of these games to my students, I say, did they really play dressed in that gear? Well, yes, they did, but they were quite restricted. But it was just how women were generally restricted at the time. And so yes, but the important thing is they didn't want to modify the rules. They wanted to play the same rules that the men played. And there's been that little debate has also played out with the advent of the National Women's League in terms of should the quarters be shorter, should the ball be smaller, should there be the same number of players on the field, etc. My research has found that women have always wanted to play the same game that the men have played, not a modified form of football. So that's an interesting observation, I think, on what's happening now and what happened back then when it started.
And early women's games were often associated with charity events. So firstly, what were the funds raised used for? And secondly, were the games effective as a fundraiser?
So the early games of women's football, which, as I say, started in Perth and then spread to other states, what gave legitimacy to those games and what gave the games a purpose was the fact that nearly all of the games were for fundraising purposes. 1915, World War I had just broken out, and we were receiving reports of Anzacs doing battle at Gallipoli. The very first games of women's football in Perth were fundraisers for the comforts of the Anzacs. And it's this that allowed an opportunity for women to play, because these teams were mainly workplace teams, and their employers, in support of the war effort, said, look, the men are away at war, many of our sporting competitions have ceased, but we need a diversion, we need some fundraising event that's going to attract crowds and that they'll hand over their sixpence to watch, women's football was the go, and therefore women stepped up to play that role in charity events. And that became a bit of a template throughout the history of women's football. It was taken to a new level in the same way during and immediately after World War II. Periods of time where the men's football competition dips or goes into abeyance, particularly during World War or during the Great Depression, for example, have provided an opportunity for women to step up and have their opportunity to play. Part of the reason for that is when the men return, or when men are playing football, they commandeer all the facilities, all the grounds. And so women weren't really left with encouragement to play football because men had control of all the facilities. And the obvious answer back then was to perhaps say, oh, women, you can play on a Sunday, because the men's competitions were on a Saturday. But the women then ran into the opposition by the church, who said, no, we don't like sport being played on a Sunday, and what's more, we particularly don't like women taking on male sports. So they had a double whammy against them, which has restricted their acceptance and their involvement in the sport.
Yeah, and what was the public's response to the charity games played by women? Was there a negative response, or was it mocked?
If you read the newspaper accounts of the day, you'll find that often there was a slightly mocking, disbelieving tone by the press, and then they would report on people going to watch these games, and the spectators themselves were a little bit initially ambivalent. But once, according to the reports, once they saw the women actually played and realised that they had a bit of skill and that they could actually play football, they warmed to the fact that these women were actually having a fair income go and providing a genuine contest. Now, of course, it was a somewhat restricted contest because they initially had the long skirts, and you have to bear in mind, like these women playing in the national competition today, that hardly had any background or training in football. For some women, this was the first game of football they'd ever played. And just like in the national competition, this was the first time they'd actually had access to the same sort of nutrition, training, skill development for the very first time. And I know some people have criticised the standard of play because of that, but you have to realise they're starting from virtually a zero base in that respect. And these, and in the same way, back in during the Great War, these women were also kicking the football for the first time. So that's a similarity in a way.
What was the impact that women had on the VFL in the 1930s and 40s?
The 1930s and 40s is an interesting period in women's football, and it had an impact on the VFL in that for the very one of the earliest times that the VFL got involved in promoting women's football was during the 1930s, when charity games were held for the unemployed, because we're in the early years of the Great Depression. So clubs like Carlton, for example, and Richmond and North Melbourne and a couple of others decided it would be a good idea to support women from their clubs or their suburbs to play fundraising games. So in this case, one notable case, it's notable because the earliest film we have of women playing is actually from a Carlton-Richmond game in 1933, played at Princes Park, which is said to have attracted a crowd of 10,000. So we actually have footage of the game. How else did the club support? Well, they had players that were coaching the women's team, one for Richmond, one from Carlton. So there was a backing of the VFL clubs at this point to support women's football. However, it didn't last. I have to say the history of women's football is a very fragmented stop-start arrangement. These teams form for maybe a season or two at the most, and then they disband. I don't think they disband for lack of interest by the women. They disband because of lack of access to the resources and lack of support from male administrators and particular clubs that don't see their support as necessary for the ongoing benefit of the women's competition.
How did the VFL and male players respond to women playing football and drawing large crowds of up to 40,000 people?
Sorry, can you ask that question again?
Oh yeah. How did the VFL and male players respond to women playing football and drawing large crowds?
So, because nowadays, obviously, they're very supportive of the women.
Okay.
Back then, were they supportive or
Right.
were they? Yeah.
Okay, so back in, again, the early 30s, large crowds were being attracted. This, in fact, is a general phenomenon in this period, the rise of mass spectator sports. So lots of people were going to watch Farlap win races. Lots of people were going to see the Bodyline Test series, and lots of people were going to watch VFL football in particular. And in that context, it's not surprising that large crowds also attended games of women's football, not just in Melbourne, but around Australia. So there's a national spread of the game, but it's very stop-start. So even though games in South Australia, for example, at this time were attracting crowds of 41,000 as part of the big carnival that day, it didn't generate an ongoing competition. We don't have an ongoing competition in women's football until 1981, when the Victorian Women's Football League is formed. So even though there's a bit of a novelty about it, it attracts a crowd. Oh, let's go and see women play. This will be interesting. This will be fun. This will be a bit of a laugh. Crowds go along. They watch women play. They're impressed, but it's not seen as something that, oh, we should start up an ongoing competition. It's more, well, that was interesting to fill in a buy round, or that was interesting just to provide something different as a fundraiser, but it was never legitimised or conceptualised as an ongoing competition that they should have.
Yeah, and you touched on, just go to that. Yeah, you touched on before how the women's football lost by its sort of stop-start. Was it a mistake that the VFL or state governments did not capitalise on the success that those, as you said, those sort of buy rounds had?
So the stop-start nature of the women's football across Australia, some people think, well, why didn't the government step in and support it, or shouldn't they have had a role in doing that? Well, thinking back, we have to understand that the VFL, the SANFL and the WAFL, these were really independent competitions, men's competitions, which really weren't getting much government funding at all, or government direction. So to expect the government to step in or say we'd like to encourage a women's football league during that period when government funding of sport was relatively low, it just wasn't going to happen. In the same way, these men's competitions had enough worry of their own trying to maintain a viable competition and funding and liaising with councils to make sure the grounds are up to standard, etc. So, in a way, we can understand that perhaps, if they did think of it, it was in terms of, well, this is just a financial burden perhaps that we can't bear. And their main focus was always on the men's competition. Having said that, there's an interesting anecdote which is mentioned in the book that I've co-authored, Play On, The Hidden History of Women's Football, where we for the first time reveal that way back in the Great War period, after a game had been played in Ballarat, the very first game of women's football played in Victoria in 1918, the teams that played, the Khaki girls and the Lucas girls, wrote to the VFL. And if you look, what has been uncovered is in the minute book of the VFL is their response to the women saying, we'd like to play a game in Melbourne. And the VFL were actually supportive and said, yes, we would support that and we're prepared to provide umpires for you. But once the war ended, the momentum for women's football was lost slightly, and it seems that that opportunity to play a women's football game in Melbourne during the war was just bypassed and forgotten about, even though the VFL itself had said, yes, we will support it. So there was a falling away, which seems to happen almost regularly. Women's football rises up, there's a bit of support and enthusiasm, but then it wanes, or the lack of support or lack of access to facilities always seems to cast a pall over the game where it's not continued on.
Why do you believe the surprisingly rich history of women's football is not known by the average footy fan?
Women's football has a particularly rich and diverse history, and it's an interesting way to also track the history of the code in general in terms of its support over the years for women's football. Why hasn't it attracted ongoing support, or why has this diverse history been ignored or downplayed? It's partly because football is seen as a masculine sport, only played by men, coached by men, administered by men. But that's a bit of a furphy. That's not actually true, but it's a perception. Right back since the game started in the middle of the 19th century, women have been attracted to watching football. And if you read the early newspaper accounts, the journalists comment specifically on the large numbers of females watching football. So there's something about the code that is attractive to women. In 1876, a young girl wrote to her school magazine and said, why can't we have a football team just like the boys do? So as early as 1876, women were expressing a desire to play football, but they were never given the opportunity. It would have gone against the grain of society, which saw women as the weaker sex, not capable of playing football, and it wasn't until the 1915 and World War I that really gave women the opportunity to play. But this history of women has been overlooked by the governing authorities and by the players themselves. Players that coached women's football teams in the 1930s and 40s, Jack Dyer is a classic example. Jack Dyer, Captain Blood, well-known football identity, umpired a women's match in 1947. When you read Jack Dyer's biography, and when you read the history of the Richmond Football Club, there is no mention made of Jack Dyer coaching a women's team or the club having a team as early as 1933. So there's like a blind spot. It's not seen as legitimate, it's not seen as interesting perhaps, but it's still part of the club's history, and it's only being uncovered and rediscovered as teams now wanting to play in the AFLW suddenly had to justify their interest in women's football as part of their bid for a licence. And that's where the Western Bulldogs in particular, who've had a history of support of women's football dating back at least to the 40s, and certainly kept women's football alive in the 50s. I think that heritage has helped the Western Bulldogs with their bid for an initial licence.
And in your article, both of women's football has been a 100-year revolution. You stated that many games and competitions had been set up across Australia. A, do you think a national competition would have been successful, would have worked back in the 1930s and 40s? And B, if the VFL had supported the early success of women's football and adopted national competition early on, what do you think that league would look like today?
So, could there have been a national women's football league earlier than 2017? Well, certainly earlier than 2020, because that's when Gil McLachlan decided to bring it forward a couple of years. So they recognised there was a groundswell of women's support for a national league. There was a prototype competition that sprang up with the VFL sides. Let's understand that there wasn't a men's national competition officially until 1990, when the VFL became the AFL, and that was driven by the fact that the Swans, South Melbourne, was sent to Sydney, and the West Coast Eagles and then South Australia came into the competition. So it's been slow for the men's national competition to actually get going. The very first interstate game of women, between women, was played in 1959, I believe, between a team mainly made up of Footscray women, went down to Tasmania and played a Tasmanian team. So that was the first time that an interstate game was played. But in 1947, the VFL set up a round-robin competition, a little bit like how we have the AFLW competition today, where in a very condensed format, there were 6 or 7 VFL women's teams that played each other in a round-robin comp and played off, I think it was Footscray and South Melbourne, played off as the winners, in the grand final of that competition. Why was that competition played? It was legitimate because it was raising funds for the Food for Britain appeal. But once that appeal was over, the women's round-robin competition stopped. It conceivably could have gone on each season, but for some reason, whether lack of support, lack of vision, lack of legitimacy, or an interest really in the men's competition and not the women's competition, that round-robin competition didn't survive. But it could have been a model for how a national competition could have been set up, similar to what we have today.
In your opinion, is it a shame that the VFL/AFL have only just reacted to creating a women's league, where there's obviously, as you've mentioned before, a rich history of women playing football in Australia?
Look, it is a shame. The AFL, even though they've done a fantastic job and there's been phenomenal success with the competition kicking off in 2017, they've only paid lip service to recognising the long history of women's football. If you listen to Gil McLachlan and others, they'll say, women's football has been played for 100 years, but they don't themselves know much of the backstory. They don't know that the earliest film footage was 1933. They don't know that the record crowd was way back in the early period. They don't know enough of the history of women's football. And essentially that's because it's been, it's an uncovered, it's a hidden history. As we know, there's very little mention of women playing football in club histories, even though women, various AFL clubs have had those clubs support teams at various stages in their history. But it doesn't seem worthy enough to appear in the official club histories. Therefore it flies under the radar, and the AFL and AFL supporters don't know enough about their own history to recognise that.
What were some of the most pivotal moments in women's football over the last 10 years?
There have been a number of pivotal moments in women's football over the last 10 years. One that I like to point to, and it's well publicised one, the very first female AFL commissioner was the appointment of Sam Mostyn in 2005. So here, for the first time, we have a female voice on the AFL Commission. And that's important because up until then, it had been all men making decisions about an all-male game. But Mostyn comes on and I think shakes the Commission up a little bit with her views about football and her support of women's football in general, and a female voice was seen as very, I believe, was a game changer in terms of the AFL Commission. So full marks to them for creating a position for a female commissioner. That was a fantastic move by them. The other thing that happened was in 2007, the AFL appointed a female football development manager, and that was Jan Cooper, based in Perth. They couldn't ignore the fantastic, phenomenal growth in women's football at the grassroots level coming through the system. So young girls were playing. Young girls were then looking for a teenage competition to play in as a stepping stone into playing into a senior competition. So Jan Cooper was appointed to make sure there was development pathways for that. The other important turning point, not so directly impacting on women's football, but the place of women in football, was the appointment of Peggy O'Neill as the very first AFL club, female club president. So again, this is another voice. When the AFL presidents get together, as they do regularly, here's a female voice being heard and giving an alternate view to many of the traditional views that were being heard. So there's three key turning points, I think, in the last 10 years or so.
Just to jump back quickly before we do it. You talked about how almost round robin tournaments and everything, they got up and then they struggled and they couldn't keep going.
Yeah.
Why did the VWFL, the one that started in it was 81, wasn't it, around there? Why did that manage to last for as long as it did and it's still going when all these other comps?
Okay, so the VWFL, as we know, is the first ongoing women's competition. Began in 1981 and has been playing ever since, until it was dismantled by VFL Victoria in a shake-up of women's football around the nation. Why did that competition last and other previous games or competitions fall by the wayside? We have to understand that the VWFL was essentially run by women for women without the support, without hardly any support by the VFL at that point. And it was seen as, they were really pushing against it, where they were being ridiculed, they were struggling to get grounds, they were struggling to get administrative support, etc. But they had key administrators that pushed hard and had a commitment to women's football. We're talking people like Lisa Hardiman, Barb Hampson, Debbie Lee, Marie Cave, a whole host of player administrators that just believed in women's football. And they really struggled to get support of the VFL. The VFL weren't falling over themselves to support women's football. It was those women themselves and their determination to maintain their competition that has led to the success of, I think, women's football today. Because, as we know, the VWFL went on to then set up, or help to set up, national championships. So each state team played in a carnival together. So that was an initiative that they took. And after that, the Western Bulldogs and the Melbourne Football Club, with the backing of the league, agreed to support women's exhibition games, and that gave them a whole new window of opportunity for women's football.
One more, sorry. So when you talk about the turning point, like as in now obviously the AFL, even the VFL guys, they're very supportive of the women playing. you talked about how most of these things, that even the VFL, they weren't supporting the WVFL or the VFLW.
Yep.
When's that point where it stopped going from we're not supporting you to suddenly we're pouring billions or millions into this? What caused that point, and why did it turn so dramatically?
Okay, there are a number of significant turning points that have led to the phenomenal success of the AFLW. And they're little incremental stepping stones. When they happen at the time, you don't think, oh, this is going to lead to a national competition, or this is going to lead to a lot of money for women's football. Excuse me. There have been particular persons that have been fantastically supportive of women's football. Think of Susan Alberti, who invited to a function of the VWFL, its grand final, pulled out a chequebook and said, there you go, there's $25,000. There have been particular individuals like that, some well known and some in the background, that have stepped up and put their money where their mouth is. And that's been an important stepping stone for women's football. The other thing we have to understand is partly the political, call it political background to this, in that it took 3 girls bringing a test case towards VCAT tribunal to say they wanted to play with the boys. VCAT saying, no, you can't play with the boys, there has to be separate competitions. And therefore the AFL VFL responding by saying, well, we need to set up separate competitions for the girls because there's a legal precedent being set here. So the AFL realised that there was a gap in the competition. All these girls being attracted to Auskick in phenomenal numbers, all these girls playing junior football, and particularly at school level. Women's football is the fastest growing sport in schools, and the AFL have recognised this and realised it's a growth market for them. What they didn't have was there was nothing between girls finishing their junior football at age 12 or 13 where they could play with boys, nothing between that and the Victorian Women's Football League. So once that gap was filled by the AFL saying, well, we feel legally bound now to provide a pathway for women, girls came flooding in to play. And that's provided the phenomenal growth in the VWFL in particular, but also in other states where girls now have a pathway between playing underage football and then making their way into a fully fledged senior women's competition. I have to say, it's partly the recognition that this is a new market for the AFL to exploit that's really driven their interest in and support of women's football. Because the numbers are phenomenal. We're talking hundreds of thousands of women now wanting to play football. And so the AFL and sponsors have realised this is something we should latch onto. This is a tide we need to ride into the new future of a more inclusive code of football, which includes women.
What you touched on before how women's football has seen monumental growth at grassroots level. What impact does the success of the AFLW have on grassroots football for women?
Okay, the bright new future for women's football is the fact they now have a national competition on television. And also the fact that these games in the inaugural season were free to the public. So that's created a fantastic audience for women's football. For young girls who can now see the best players in the country playing football live on television or live at the game, this has provided fantastic role models for them. So young girls are now saying, well, I want to do what they've done. leave aside the money that these elite players are earning, and there's been some debate about how much money they should be earning, but these women are essentially playing for the love of it at the elite level, but they're providing fantastic role models and pathways and examples for girls that will follow in their footsteps. And these will be girls that will grow up playing football, unlike some of the players now in AFLW who have swapped from another sport or another code and are still adapting to how to play women's football. In the future, we're going to see women that have played Auskick, underage football, VWFL football, and then made their way into an elite AFL club. So that means we're going to see a significant increase in the quality, a significant increase in the pool of women that can be selected from, and more significant rewards for those women that do make it. So all of that is nothing else but a bright future for women's football.
And on the flip side, what do you believe are the biggest challenges AFLW faces moving forward, and what do they have to do to sustain the early success?
So does women's football have any challenges facing it? Yes, it does. There was some rumours that women that weren't happy with the direction of women's football could possibly set up an alternate competition. Now, we may think that's fanciful, but when we look at the history of cricket, for example, and Kerry Packer setting up a World Series in opposition to the Australian Cricket Board's own team, it's important to keep the players happy, because what undermined Australian cricket was the players not being looked after, the players not being paid well, and the players not having a sense of ownership of the sport that they were involved in. So there's a lesson to be learned from that sort of scenario. I'm not necessarily saying it's going to happen in the AFLW, but it's a little warning light to, we can't just pay the players peanuts and expect them to be full-time athletes for 8 or 10 weeks and then just go back to their normal lives. There needs to be a proper understanding of the need for player welfare, for example, and player development, and a career pathway for these women if they're serious about supporting the women's competition. So that would be my concern, that they don't, that the AFL don't necessarily pour enough resources into women's football to make it a sustainable competition.
In your opinion, who has been the most influential figure in the history of women's football?
I believe the most influential figure in the history of women's football, and I'm smiling because it's not one you'll expect. Possibly it's Trixie West. No one's heard of Trixie West. Trixie West came from the north of England to Australia in the 1920s. Trixie West was responsible for the first women's team in Victoria wearing proper footy gear. That is, shorts and a football guernsey and football boots. Because up until then, the women had been playing in dresses and long skirts. And it was at Trixie West's initiative who said, come on girls, we need to be playing a proper game of football wearing proper football gear. And in 1921, at a game at St Kilda Junction, she arranged to borrow football gear from the St Kilda Football Club, and the women played a game of football in proper football gear for the first time. So I'm nominating her as a significant female involved in the history of women's football. And look, it's only a little stepping stone, but women playing football in long dresses wouldn't have lasted very long. Trixie West coming along and saying, hey girls, just like they do in women's soccer back in England, which I've seen, why don't we also wear the male football gear so that we can actually kick and run and mark just like the men do. So for me, that's her influence was pivotal at that particular time.
Why did you choose to study and follow the history of women's football firstly?
My interest in women's football stems right back to the PhD that I wrote, the first ever PhD on the history of Australian rules football, where I looked at the phenomenon of women attending and watching Australian rules football and recognised that this was something unique across the world's codes. Women were watching numbers in around about the proportion of 40 to 50%, right from the early days. When you look at other codes of football in the 19th century, soccer, maybe 10%, rugby, maybe 15%, women going to watch their games. So there was something about Aussie rules that attracted women to it. And that piqued my interest to then go on and explore women's involvement in football, which led to the uncovering of females playing the game. And that's eventually what led to the publication with my co-author Brunette Lenkick of Play on the Hidden History of Women's Australian Rules Football.
What do you think so? What do you think? You mentioned how it's the AFL, how the women clearly, like, women seem to love Australian rules football when on other sports it is there, but it's not the same level of support. What do you think it is about Australian rules football that is appealing to women?
So I guess the other question to consider is, what is it that makes Australian rules football particularly appealing to women? Well, the obvious answer is, well, you need to ask women, I guess. Here's a man saying, well, this is what I think, this is why I think Aussie rules is appealing. One of the reasons I point to is it's the nature of the game itself, and that it's made up of different body types. And this notion of players flying high, big solid ruckman, little mosquito fleet players, it's the interaction of all those different body types in a game that's played over the entire field, importantly without an offside rule, which stops that two teams just crashing against each other. Aussie rules is a 360-degree game made up of a whole range of skills which make it attractive not just to women but to men as well. But women also see the beauty and are attracted to it. The other thing that attracts women to it is it's a very tribal game. It grew on suburban rivalries, and women as a part of their local community were drawn into these suburban rivalries. Everyone from Collingwood hated everyone from Carlton. It was a suburban thing, and women and families and the local community were part of that. So you get newspaper reports of women dressing, going to the football and adorning their prams in club colours, or wearing little rosettes, or carrying Cupid dolls to the football in club colours. So women were very much entrenched in that suburban tribal club rivalry, so they got drawn into a love of the game through that as well.
Yep, and well, lastly, what is your favourite moment in the history of women's football?
If I was to nominate a favourite moment in the history of women's football, I would struggle to nominate just one. I must admit, I really did enjoy that very first game of the AFLW football season, partly because it caught the AFL completely off guard. They had to shift the venue because the crowd interest was so much that the Olympic Park wasn't going to cater for them, so they had to shift it to a venue. And then a massive crowd came in and were locked out. So the favourite part of that is, I wasn't at the game, but I watched the television live coverage. The favourite part of the game was seeing Gil McLachlan, the AFL CEO, having to go outside the ground and apologise to supporters that they had to lock the gates. And that, for me, was a fantastic moment where the AFL, through Gil and McLachlan, realised we've got a phenomenal success on our hands here, where we've had a lockout game for the very first match of AFLW. So that, to me, was a justification that now was the time for women's football, based on this tremendously long and rich and diverse history that had led to this point over 100 years leading up to the AFL hosting a lockout match in the very first game of a national competition.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was seriously amazing. Sorry for too many questions.
No.